Good day. Welcome to Sustainable Development. Today we would be having an introduction to the overall topic that we would be looking at over the course of the semester. So let's start first by looking at development in general before we get specifically and focused on the issue and concept of sustainable development. So when we say development, we are actually talking more than just about economic development. So typically when you hear the word development, we often think of things like GDP, we think of things like industrialization, employment, and how these things can affect our standard of living. Okay. Um, but in reality, when we look at development, development should include more than just the economic aspects of our daily lives and our national focus. So development should also look at things like freedoms. What level of freedoms do you have in your nation or your country? Is there freedom of choices, like freedom of speech, freedom of religion, to choose your form of worship, and other types of freedoms? So all of these things should also be considered. What about equity? Equality of access to essential things, essential resources, for example, that are needed to have a good healthy life. For example, equality of access to healthcare, basic healthcare systems, equality of access to education, equality and in terms of your rights to have a safe environment, one that is not where environmental pollution is limited, or one where you are not in danger of being physically harmed. So equality reaches out into all these different aspects, and there's so many more areas that would have to be considered when we look at development. So as you can already see that many of these issues, um, many of these issues reaches out into areas that are not only economic, but economy or economics would have an influence in these areas as well. So what we actually find in reality is that many countries actually do not demonstrate many of these other types of development levels here. And over the course of the semester, we would be looking at some very specific areas where focus is development, and more specifically, sustainable development. So with this in mind, we can see that the whole concept of development is really a very complex thing. And it is a comprehensive process that includes not only economic, but it also reaches into the social sphere as well as environmental changes that are happening all around us, and how those environmental changes can not only affect economics and society, but also be affected by economics and society. So how do we define sustainable development? So here we have a definition: sustainable development as defined by the United Nations World Commission on the Environment and Development. So sustainable development is defined as meeting the needs of the present. So those of us who are on the earth at this point in time, meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And of course, when we talk about these needs, bear in mind that everything relates right back to the resources that are available to us. So sustainable development cannot be achieved without present day social equity, right? So remember, we're talking about present day. What do we do in the present? Because remember, what we do in the present affects the future, right? So we're saying that sustainable development cannot be achieved without present day social equity if some groups of people continue to jeopardize the well-being of others. So what do we mean by that? For example, We have where we have emissions of greenhouse gases by industrialized countries. We find that that leads to global warming and flooding. And what happens is quite often the recipients of those negative impacts would be the poorer countries in low-lying areas, right? So when this happens, what's the consequence of all of that? This often results in the displacement of peoples and the impoverishment of entire island nations. Because what we find is very often the consequences of global warming and flooding, you find that low-lying island nations tend to be most at risk. So you can have entire nations um, now being inhabitable, and large numbers of people have to be physically displaced, and their entire lives are now disrupted and oftentimes destroyed. Okay, so what we have is a situation where we have to understand that part of sustainable development means that we have to have a mindset of fairness, a mindset of justice in terms of how our activities, the things that we do today, how can it affect somebody else? You know, you cannot be thinking in a silo or in a vacuum that, you know, I must only be about meeting my own needs and not think about how the actions that you take to meet those needs, how can it affect someone else? All right, so sustainable development must balance the interests of different groups of people. And in particular, you have to be concerned about vulnerable groups as well, because remember, they are often not in a position to even have a voice, to have political power, or to have a say in decision making. So you must take their interests into consideration as well. You also have to look at what is happening within your own generation. And then you also have to think about what happens among generations. So remember, we said sustainable development is not only about the decisions we make today, but it's also about how the decisions we make today can affect future generations. So how do we develop in a wise, sustainable way, carry out development activities to ensure that there is economic development, there's social equity, and then there's environmental responsibility. All of these taken into consideration in terms of the decisions that we make towards development. And how would these decisions affect not only us at present, how would it affect vulnerable groups at present, and how would it affect future generations? So when we talk about generations, you also want to bear in mind the timelines for a generation, because I think right now a generation is essentially defined as a 20 to 30 year period. So for example, the next generation that follows after us, how do the decisions that we take now, what would be the outcome in another 20 to 30 years, and then even beyond that? Because remember, as we've discussed in previous courses, a lot of the environmental problems that we face today can oftentimes be traced back to the rise of the Industrial Revolution a couple hundred years before. So today we are still feeling the effects of it, and we have to remember these things, because in the same way, decisions we make now can affect future generations. So here we have a representation of the three spheres of sustainability. This should not be unfamiliar to you guys. So this is just reinforcement here. So we have our three spheres of sustainability. We have environmental, social, and economic. Here what we can see is when we consider sustainable development, we have to understand that none of these spheres actually activities can be carried out in isolation of anything else. There is always overlapping. So when you look at economics only, the focus tend to be on things like finances, profits, economic growth, and advancements in those areas. When you have a social focus only, you're only interested in living standards. What kind of living standards do you have? Uh, Health, education, safety, equal opportunities and equal rights. And then an environmental focus only looks at things like natural resource use, environmental management in terms of pollution prevention, etc. But then we see in reality, it does not work like that. Because what happens is we have seen in the past where the focus is oftentimes only on social, um, economics, or sometimes environmental. And when you focus entirely on only one area at the expense of other areas, then you find all kinds of broader problems would eventually result when you ignore the other issues. So here we have represented on those diagrams, um, for example, where you shift your focus a little bit, where you can have environment and economics, then you would need to look at things like energy efficiency. Um, what instruments can we use, such as subsidies and incentives, etc., in order to minimize and prevent pollution? You're looking at conservation of your natural resources. Where you have a social and environmental focus, you're looking at things like environmental justice. That might include things like uh, how do we ensure that we have a sustainable development without displacing indigenous people from their lands? Um, you're looking at things like ensuring that the vulnerable have access to land rights, development, uh, whether it's in terms of loans, etc. You're also looking at how do my activities, my social development activities, how would that affect our natural environment, for example, in terms of sensitive species, etc. All right. Um, and then, of course, you have the overlap here where you have to focus on economic and social, where you look at business ethics or business fairness and fairness of trade and workers' rights, etc. All right. But true sustainability will actually give attention to all three spheres. And this is where we have true sustainability occurring right here in the middle. All right. And as we will learn over the course of the semester, that, as I said before, it's a very, very complex issue. And it is something that is, in truth and in fact, it's often very difficult to achieve. All right. But it's a goal that we must always have in the forefront of our minds at all times. So arguably, the most critical problem for sustainable development in each country, so this is a universal problem. The problem is eradication of extreme poverty. So we say that poverty stands in the way of achieving most other goals of development, from a clean environment to personal freedom. So what are we really talking about here when we talk about extreme poverty being this major challenge to achieving sustainable development? So say, for example, you look at the goal of trying to achieve clean air. In many countries and some regions in countries, um, there is such poverty that the focus of these poor communities is essentially survival. It's their immediate survival. They would not be thinking about things like what decisions should I make so that I don't utilize things such as choices for fuel that would not produce air pollution. First of all, where there is poverty, there's often lack of knowledge and education. And then again, that motivation to meet that immediate need, choices are not available to you. So in a scenario like what I just described about needing that choice for fuel, you find they may make choices to the most readily available fuel for them. They'll be looking for wood or coal or different types of fuel that would actually produce a lot of air pollution. And The feedback for them is oftentimes that air pollution will now affect them. It will deteriorate their health. And then, of course, you already know that air pollution is one of those types of pollution that is never relegated to any particular physical location. It, by virtue of wind currents and wind patterns, it can now be transmitted to distant locations. So now we have a problem here. And so a major focus for any country that is working towards sustainable development is the eradication of poverty. All right, so this is really what this point is about. So at the core of sustainable development, that sustainable development goal, poverty is really critical to address, regardless of whether you're looking at environmental goals, economic, social, etc. So let's look briefly at the evolution of sustainable development. This whole concept of sustainable development and our thinking on sustainable development did not always exist. So sustainable development, this was a key theme of the United Nations on the, beg your pardon, I'm just checking this again. So sustainable development was a key theme of the United Nations Conference on the Human Environment in Stockholm in 1972. Right? So the issue was now being raised in a global forum for the first time. Okay? So the concept was coined explicitly to suggest that it was possible to achieve economic growth and industrialization without environmental damage. So we're now at this level, we're now beginning to think about what sustainable development is. How can we achieve development without damaging the environment? So following that global conference in ensuing decades, mainstream sustainable development thinking was further developed, and some other landmark conferences and agreements. We find there was a World Conservation Strategy that was developed in 1980, then the Brundtland Report 1987, and then following that, we all know about the United Nations Conference on Environment and Development in Rio 1992. We know that one was a major, major conference there. And additionally, beyond that, what we find is that national governments, they would also have, at the governmental level, they're planning and engagements with stakeholders such as business leaders and non-government organizations at a national level to plan and implement the strategies for sustainable development. Let's look at some of these key achievements from those various reports and conferences in brief. So the Stockholm 1972 conference, this was the first global environmental conference. This was held in Sweden in 1972. This conference adopted mostly broad environmental policy goals and objectives rather than detailed positions on the issues. So remember, this was the first global conference. So at this point, we're now trying to properly define sustainable development, identify the issues, and try to figure out how to approach it. So what we found coming out of this, this first conference is that there was now, for the first time, a growing global awareness of environmental issues. So in the next decade, 1987, there was a Brundtland Report. So what happened here? Coming out of the Brundtland Report, we now have the introduction of the concept of sustainable development. And it also described how we can achieve. So now we have a framework coming together here, guidelines coming together out of this report. So what did the report produce? It explored the causes of environmental degradation. So it now gives you guidelines as to what are some of the indicators and the things that we should be looking for to make a determination as to if environmental degradation is occurring. It also attempted to understand the interconnectedness between those spheres of development that we looked at, the social, economic, and environmental. So we're now trying to define this interconnectedness between the spheres. And also coming out of the report is that policy solutions were developed that integrated all three areas of those spheres, the social, economic, and environmental. So again, as we said, a framework was being developed here. By Rio 1992, we had another major conference, and the objective of this conference was to produce a broad agenda and a new blueprint being guidelines for international action. So we have an international action on the environment and development issues. So we, at the conference, we have many nations on a governmental level, as well as other stakeholders coming together to develop these guidelines or blueprint, which would be now made available at a country level to provide guidelines for what actions you need to take on the environment and development issues, and also to define what kind of international cooperation can be achieved or can be facilitated in order to achieve these sustainable development goals that we are focused on. So this conference had many achievements, and some of the guidelines or blueprints that came out of it was the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And this another example is the Convention on Biological Diversity. So these are some of the more prominent ones that have come out of that conference that we might be familiar with. Then in 2002, we had the World Summit in Johannesburg, South Africa. What happened here is that a set of provisions for activities and measures specifically focused on areas of water, energy, health, agriculture, biological diversity, and other concerns were developed and made available. So now the details are now beginning to drill down into the details. Because remember, as we already established before, this whole issue of sustainable development is very complex. And the more the concept of sustainable development begins to evolve, we find that it's necessary to get more and more detailed if we want to have any kind of progress in terms of achieving goals. Now, as we're talking about goals, another major, I think one that's missing here, but we will look at it briefly in another slide, is Millennium Development Goals. But another one that is most current to us right now, in 2015, New York, another under the UN umbrella, another conference that took place, we had coming out of that the development of the Sustainable Development Goals. There are 17 of them. Each goal is essentially like the equivalent of an aim. This is my major aim. This is what I want to do. And for each of those, we find that we have a number of targets. And those targets will come like the various objectives I need to achieve in order to satisfy the aim that I have. So we have 17 sustainable development goals, and the combination of those 17 sustainable development goals, there are 169 targets or objectives. Okay, and shortly after that, 2 months later, we had the Paris Agreement on Climate Change. We're all familiar with the Paris Agreement. It's been in the news a lot in recent years. So this was signed and ratified by 187 parties also in 2015. So as it relates to sustainable development, let us look briefly at small island developing states. So SIDS, though affected by similar challenges to development as other developing countries, SIDS have their own particular vulnerabilities. So what we find is in 2012 in Rio de Janeiro, um, many countries came together to discuss the challenges, the particular challenges that SIDS would face, since there are some unique challenges here. And some of the issues that SIDS would face would relate to size, for example. So many islands, small island developing states have small land masses. Um, where there's small land masses, you find natural resources would also be limited. Okay. Um, Many cities also face remoteness. Now, us here in the Caribbean, remoteness might not be such a big challenge for us, but in many other parts of the world, for example, if we look at the Pacific Islands, you find that they are often remote and far removed from other cities and countries, and often and there are many more islands than we have here in the Caribbean, which makes management of resources even more difficult. Then they also have a limitation in terms of the export base. So if you have small land mass and you have a limited amount of natural resources, by extension, you can expect that your productivity is also going on a global scale. Your productivity is also going to be small. And then that means then that your export, um, in terms of in terms of your trade and your ability to grow your GDP is going to also be limited. So when you put that now in the context of the global environment, um, environmental challenges can occur. First of all, we know SIDS are very susceptible to the impacts of climate change. Um, as we saw before, SIDS will often be affected by the global warming, um, rising sea levels, disappearance of land masses, displacement of peoples, etc. Then if you have economic shocks, external economic shocks, let's look at, for example, what is happening during this period 2020, 21, and we don't know how long the COVID pandemic is going to go on. And we have seen where the COVID pandemic has had major economic impacts across the world. So if you have your major trading partners that you depend on, um, and because of your limited production capacity, because of your small size, when your major trading partners, like whether it's the United States or China, where you have these huge markets, if they begin to experience financial challenges, it's now going to affect your ability for economic growth and well-being. So this is another one of the issues that SIDS often have to contend with. All right, so these are some of the issues that had been addressed in Rio 2012. Now, as it relates to SIDS here in our region, we have the Institute of Sustainable Development that works very closely with UE, and the offices, I believe, are based at UE. What do they do? What is their goal or function? They provide skilled and competent um, they work with providing skilled and competent decision makers for sustainable development of the Caribbean. So they work with decision makers to try to build up their knowledge and capacity where decision making from a sustainable development perspective is concerned. But they also work with other stakeholders to build their capacity in order to build resilience and strength in small island developing states, particularly here in the Caribbean. All right. So as I said, Trinidad and Tobago has agreed to the Millennium Development Goals that were outlined at the UN Millennium Goals Summit in 2000. Um, so essentially that Millennium Development Goals would have been like the precursor to the Sustainable Development Goals, all right? Um, so these goals are intended to improve the lives of the world's poorest. So this commitment has extended to incorporate the Sustainable Development Goals of 2015 as a matter of priority. So what we're saying is Trinidad has committed to that. And during the course of the semester, you will see that as we move through one topic focus to another, we will see when we refer to some of our national policies, etc., where development policies and plans have been built around that framework of sustainable development goals that have been outlined by the international community at these UN conferences. Okay, so you begin to become more and more familiar with it and how it is applied in the various contexts. Okay, so it's very important for us to know that these sustainable development goals that we are talking about, this is actually the next generation of the Millennium Development Goals that were referred to here. So I would like to thank you for joining me for today's lesson. I would like to refer you to eClassroom for today's activity. Thank you.